saw my good friend Danny Davis join us. So for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Congressman Bill Johnson, and thanks to all of you for attending today's important briefing on the current state of affairs in Sri Lanka. As many of you know, I am very proud to co-chair the Congressional Caucus on ethnic and religious freedom in Sri Lanka with my colleague and good friend Danny Davis. We founded this caucus back in 2013 with the mission to increase awareness and educate other members of Congress on the importance of all ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka who are being excluded from society, the economy, and political life due to discrimination, harassment, and persecution. And the mission of our caucus remains not only relevant, but based on what we see, it's critical today. Wow, you know, to say that there's been a few developments since our last caucus briefing this past spring would certainly be an understatement. Sri Lanka continues to have a shortage of food, medicine, and fuel for its citizens. The World Health Organization estimates that 30% of Sri Lanka's population is food insecure. The economic crisis, coupled with government corruption by the Rajapaksa family, sparked weeks of protests that resulted in the Prime Minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, resigning, followed by the president, his brother, Gotabaya, fleeing the country and also resigning. However, these extreme circumstances also present an opportunity for positive changes in Sri Lanka, and particularly for the ethnic and religious minorities who are often the most vulnerable and marginalized. Currently, the UN Human Rights Council has commenced for the 51st session, and I'm pleased that the United States is again leading a resolution on Sri Lanka. Pressure from the international community to increase government transparency, accountability, and importantly, to take the necessary steps to resolve the economic crisis and alleviate the shortages of food and essential goods for all Sri Lankans is critical. It's also an important opportunity to emphasize the role that ethnic and religious conflicts play in this situation. Sri Lanka cannot move forward as a nation without resolving these tensions and creating accountability for human and civil rights abuses that occurred both during the Civil War and afterward. I really look forward to hearing from today's esteemed speakers on this challenging time for Sri Lanka and how the United States and our international partners can play a role in influencing Sri Lanka's new government to make the drastically needed changes. Let me now turn it over to my friend and colleague, Danny Davis, to give his opening remarks and introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you very much. And let me, first of all, commend Representative Johnson for his leadership and for the opportunity to work along with him in partnership. Bill, it's been a pleasure working with you all of this time, and I look forward to the continuation. Murtaza, well, I'll do, as co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka, I want to thank you for joining our virtual panel discussion on the current situation in Sri Lanka. It is important that we continue to openly discuss and monitor situations in this country so that we can respond quickly to the deteriorating human rights situation and advocate against further abuses during this politically unstable period. Since the beginning of the year, Sri Lanka is suffering an economic, political, and human rights crisis. During the crisis, this country had periods when its people couldn't afford to buy the most common goods such as food, fuel, medicine, and fertilizers. According to the World Health Organization, over 30% of the country's population is food insecure, and it has one of the highest rates of acute malnutrition in the world. After the country's president had resigned in July and fled amidst wide unrest, the local government continued its crackdown on dissent and targeted multiple ethnic groups in addition to already targeted human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, university students, academicians, social media commentators, and opposition and union members. This crisis presents significant challenges, especially to the most vulnerable population groups, including Tamils and Muslims. Once the country gained independence in 1948, the Sinhalese majority immediately began enacting policies and laws discriminatory towards Indians, Tamils, including the Ceylon Citizenship Act, and barred Tamils from holding Sri Lankan citizenship. The authorities also continued to detain hundreds of Muslims arrested in connection with bombings in April 2019 under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. In March, Sri Lanka's public security minister stated that the government is planning to ban more than 1,000 Islamic education institutions, madrasas, which operated outside of the national education policy. The LGBTQ community and women from ethnic minorities and indigenous communities are continuing to face increased abuse and domestic violence while forced to remain at home during COVID-19 lockdowns. And now, let me just introduce our panelists for today. Murtaza Jafri is the chairman of the Advocate Institute, an independent policy think tank based in Colombo, Sri Lanka, dedicated to economic development through free markets. He also leads the financial services division of JB Group, helping businesses and households with their investment and capital raising needs. He is also a CFA charter holder. Ajahadra is a political analyst, regularly contributes to Thinkarole, a leading Tamil daily in Sri Lanka, and also contributes to the editorial of Ilando, which is leading Tamil daily in Jaffna. Apart from this, he is running a think tank named Santri for Strategic Studies, Trimali CSST. He is an IVLP alumni who participated in a program titled U.S. Foreign Policy in Indo-Pacific in 2020. Ike Shravanjaha is an award-winning senior producer and guest host on the radio show Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting. Earlier this year, Shravanjaha reported on why the United States has 1,700 active cases against alleged perpetrators of international human rights violations, but only one criminal conviction. This story looks closely at the U.S. failure to prosecute Gotabaya Rajapaksa when he was inside the U.S. And J.S. Tennasamjam is a journalist and advocate on human rights in Sri Lanka. living in the United States. His most recent writings appear in the Diplomat, International Policy Digest, and the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, and is interviewed regularly for the podcast Global Dispatches. He has testified on Sri Lanka before the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights. We will go in that order, and I know that I have butchered your names, so please forgive me for that. And the next time I get some free time, I'm going to study the language so that I can do a better job of justice to your names and what it is that you do and have done. So we will begin with the first one and move right through as I introduced the panelists.
Thank you, Congressman Davis, for that kind introduction. Good day to you, Congressman Johnson, and good day to everybody else who is on this call today. My name is Murtaza Jaffaji, and as you introduced me, I'm the chairman of a think tank called Advocata, and I'm also part of a family business. What I have to say today is my own personal opinion, and it has no association with any institution that I'm affiliated with. And I was also asked to speak only for 5 minutes. I may exceed my quota by a couple of minutes. Let me very quickly explain how this crisis happened. It was many, many years in the making, if not decades, that it was commented about Sri Lanka that we are a people who like to eat the fruits before they have been harvested. And we have been having very loose fiscal and monetary policy for many, many decades. So there were 3 causal factors that led to this crisis. The first one was we moved away from a market economic system, which led to misallocation of resources. We artificially kept interest rates down. We artificially kept a fixed exchange rate. We subsidized the price of fuel. We basically put price controls on many food items. And therefore, during the COVID years of 2020 and 2021, there was excess stimulation in the economy. And basically, our international rating was cut. So we could not refinance our external borrowings. And we used our reserves to keep servicing our debt till we ran out of resources. The second criteria is that for a middle income country like Sri Lanka, we should have tax to GDP of about 17 to 18%. Our tax to GDP had come down to 8%, one of the lowest for a country of a middle income country like ourselves. Therefore, the government runs very, very large fiscal deficits. The third thing is there was a complete failure of all our institutions. There is excessive amount of power with the president. He's quite literally an autocrat. Our central bank was highly politicized, so they continue to fund the fiscal deficit through monetizing. The third is that our civil service also has been politicized, and therefore they are not independent. Our judiciary is also politicized, and many other institutions that are supposed to act as the checks and balances completely failed us. So although it is said that the Rajapaksas were corrupt, it was not the corruption that removed the resources, but they weakened the entire system. And therefore, it was a case of mismanagement that was contributed by incompetence, dogmatic policies. They were hostage to their own ideology. If they were more pragmatic, this crisis would not have happened. And they were listening to advisors who were very poorly advising. So those were the causal factors that led to this crisis. What is the status quo as of now? Inflation is at 70%. Food inflation is above 90%. Our economy is expected to contract by 8.7% officially. I think it might be about 10%. There continues to be a shortage of foreign exchange. So there has been a complete contraction of imports. Unemployment is rising. And the top 10% of households in Sri Lanka account for 36% of income. while the bottom 10% of households only account for 2% of income. So basically, the bottom 50% of the country is suffering, and most of the young people, unfortunately, have lost hope on the country, and the most skilled people are all looking to immigrate either temporarily to places like the Middle East or permanently to the West. So what is my reflection from an ethnic and religious list? First of all, leading up to the crisis, over many years, I have noticed that there is excess amount of religiosity in Sri Lanka, that we come from a part of the world which basically believes in spirituality, but unfortunately, people are focusing more on rituals and symbols of religion without the true meaning of religion. And therefore, basically, they are fairly cultish in their approach to the virtues of their own religion. And there is also a revisionist history, that there's a glorification of the ancient past, which is a selective reading of history, which is not the reality of the entirety of the country's history. So all of this was used to whip up nationalism, and that is how this government came into being. Now, the fallout of this crisis is it has not discriminated between any ethnic group. Everybody has fallen at the same time. And in some way, the people of the North, which I'm told, are looking at the people of the South who were better off during the conflict and say, now you know what it felt like. So it has brought a clearer understanding of how badly this country has fallen. And therefore, I believe that a great space has been created to do all the type of reforms that needed to be done over the last 40 years that never got done. And unfortunately, the way our constitution works is that we cannot trigger an election. And therefore, the former president Gotabaya Rajapaksa is gone, and there's a new president called Ranil Wickremesinghe, but he doesn't have a popular mandate. And parliament cannot be dissolved till next March. And no MP wants to dissolve parliament voluntarily because they won't be elected back. And the president has another 2 years to go. So it's unlikely that he's going to dissolve parliament. So we are quite literally stuck with this government for the next 2 years. So my recommendation is that going forward, that the country is really in a stage to do reconciliation, genuine reconciliation between equals. And there is, again, talk about the South African model. I sincerely hope that that will be furthered. The second thing is that we need new laws like a Harmony Act to ensure that all the ethnic groups live in Sri Lanka peacefully. There is also a problem that the vast majority of the population are ignorant about civics. Civics is not formally taught in our schooling system. So they do not understand about the constitution. They don't understand about the concept of human rights, of basic laws and how a system should work. And we need to spend a lot more effort in educating them. Economic literacy is also very poor. That 95% of the people really don't understand how a market economy works. We need political reform, that there is too much of power with the presidency, and we should go back to a parliamentary system and a more ceremonial presidency. We also need to have electoral reform, because our current electoral system requires too much of money to be in politics, and that lends itself to being corrupt. We also need democracy within political parties. So since I'm speaking to an American audience, some of the policy measures that can be done is that the Americans were very kind to give us $480 million on an MCC program, which we rejected. It was rejected by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government on some flimsy reasons. I sincerely hope that there's a way for us to come back and reclaim that $480 million, because this country really needs that money, and that would significantly enhance productivity and growth going forward, because the IMF themselves have predicted that the economy is going to keep contracting for the next 2 years. The second thing is that some assistance can be provided to improve civic and economic literacy in the country and a voter education. So that summarizes my comments, Congressman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm sure there will be a number of questions as we finish. And we'll go to Mr. Jatendra.
Thanks for giving this opportunity, Congressman Mr. Bill Johnson and Congressman Danny Davis, and ladies and gentlemen. As being a Tamil, I don't believe there is anything new to say. we are facing the same problems as what they faced yesterday. The powerlessness is a fundamental problem with the Tamil people. Unless there is a meaningful devolution of power, the problems of the Tamils will not be solved. Therefore, the same words and same complaints are coming at you again and again. Sri Lanka is currently looking through the lens of the economic crisis. The economic crisis has further affected the Tamil population, which has been badly affected by the war. The Tamil people were completely separated from the Southern uprising as a result of the economic crisis. The Southern uprising did not arise from the need for the fundamental changes in the island nation. Perhaps if not for the economic crisis, the Sinhalese would never have turned against the Rajapaksas. This should be understood through the singular Tamil power relations. The reconciliation with the Deep South is always impossibility when the Tamil people are powerless. The Sinhalese ruling elite was unwilling to implement at least the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. It is because of this that none of the accountability efforts made in the last 12 years have been successful. In this background, we have to conclude that the liberal Western pressure on Sri Lanka's accountability have failed. Why it failed? The West, especially the United States, should revisit why the issue of accountability in Sri Lanka has not been successful. We are not saying this from the Tamil perspective, as the issue of human rights is an integral part of the US foreign policy. US approaches have failed to force Sri Lanka, one of the smallest countries in the third world, to account for human rights. There is a clear reason for this. That is, the UNHRC resolution for accountability was brought by the United States in 2012. Because if the United States had not brought such a resolution, this issue of accountability for Sri Lanka would not have been internationalized. But the purpose of this proposal has not been fulfilled to the date. I would like to borrow a point made by the head of the CIA, Mr. Bill Burns, regarding the Sri Lankan economic crisis. Burns blamed the dumbbells on high-debt Chinese investment as a factor in Sri Lanka's economic collapse. But no doubt that's a valid point. But the question arises whether we are engaged in a dumbbell race for human rights in Sri Lanka. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wong says that we will not allow foreign countries to interfere in Sri Lanka. So when we talk about the accountability of Sri Lanka, we should not forget that we are talking about accountability of a country where China has a strong foothold. China used ethnic conflict to enter Sri Lanka. Now it is trying to strengthen its relationship with Colombo by refusing responsibility for accountability. The Tamil people accept there is no point in following failed methods anymore. A new pressure mechanism should be thought of to get a political solution for the victims of Tamils. The recently US Senator Bob Mendes, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said that the Quad countries should help Sri Lanka. That's half right. Complement that, the Quad countries should consider supporting the devolution of power. Because of this, Colombo has shown Japan's cooperation in trying to restore Sri Lanka. This can be used to the advantage to demand assurance for Sri Lanka's human rights protection mechanism. India, one of the Quad countries and regional power, had been pushing for a political solution, the Tamil people. Taking advantage of this, the Quad should push for a political solution. I would like to say one thing finally. The Tamils would not ask anything new. We are urging for a free and open society that the US people enjoy freely under the federal principle. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we will then go to Mr. Ike Shrunsaja.
Thank you, Representative Davis. And thank you, Representative Johnson, and your leadership on this caucus, and to the organizing committee who invited me here today. My name is Ike Sriskandarajah. It's a long name. We all kind of have long names. I'm a senior reporter at the Center for Investigative Reporting. And if you listen to public radio, maybe you've heard our weekly investigative show, Reveal. And it's the goal of our show, and really all investigative reporting, to have an impact and get the ear of policymakers who can affect change. So I appreciate that opportunity. I'm here to talk about two things. One is our reporting on the US response to war criminals on its own soil, and two, a new opportunity for accountability in Sri Lanka. Our own reporting at Reveal started about a year ago when we filed FOIAs for records detailing the US federal law enforcement's investigations into alleged war criminals and human rights violators who are here on US soil. And we ended up having to sue DHS and ICE, but we've obtained the records that enumerate that the US government is pursuing leads and active cases against 1,700 alleged human rights violators right here in America. The number again is 1,700. And despite that kind of shocking number, and despite decades of human rights laws that Congress has passed on genocide, war crimes, torture, to name a few, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, and the section responsible for war crimes and human rights violations and their investigations and prosecutions against alleged persecutors, they've only ever successfully convicted one person under the history of those substantive human rights laws. That was back in 2008. It was Chucky Jr., Liberia's leader's, Charles Taylor's American-born son. He was sentenced to 97 years for torture. And all the others of the 1,700 alleged violators that exist today, the government is pursuing, and the long legacy of Nazi war persecutors who were outed in the United States, they weren't criminally charged for their alleged crimes. And we wanted to know, one of the questions driving our reporting was, what happens to the rest? And that's what brings me to, I think, the reason I was invited to speak to this caucus is one of the starkest examples that we could find of impunity was that of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is a naturalized US citizen and returned to Sri Lanka in 2005 when his brother Mahinda, who I'm sure everybody in this caucus and on this call is familiar with, was elected president. Gotabaya Rajapaksa served as Secretary of Defense, overseeing the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War. International human rights groups accuse him of ordering the Sri Lankan army to commit acts of torture, white van abductions, disappearances, and in the final days of the Sri Lankan Civil War, armed forces shelling Tamil civilian areas, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands. And what is lost on many, maybe not on this call, is that during that time, Gotabaya Rajapaksa was a US citizen, and as such, subject to US laws, including substantive human rights laws. And yet, he continued to visit the United States, visiting with impunity. And as recently as 2019, he was tweeting about going to parties in Southern California, even posting videos of himself singing karaoke in a posh LA suburb. He was never charged under US war crime statute. In fact, nobody has ever been charged under the US war crime statute. And when the Department of Justice declined, two human rights groups picked up the slack. They're tiny compared to the international intelligence apparatus of the United States, and without the power of federal law enforcement. So these two NGOs acting on behalf of victims' families, they hired a private investigator to serve civil lawsuits to the former defense secretary. And in April of 2019, which was a dynamic month in Sri Lankan history, as other panelists have alluded to, the private investigator tailed Rajapaksa through Southern California, eventually serving him lawsuits in a Trader Joe's parking lot. But because they were only civil, he was able to continue on his way into that grocery store, leave the US, return to Sri Lanka, where he gave up his US citizenship and ran for president of Sri Lanka. I think we all know what happened next. And when we launched this investigation a year ago, we thought this case highlighted the gaps in the US response to war criminals on US soil, where someone could escape accountability and wind up president. Kind of a stark example. But the events of this summer and what we've seen in Sri Lanka are making us reconsider how that story ends. And after the economic collapse, as the opening remarks of Representative Johnson alluded to, popular uprising forced Rajapaksa out of office. He fled the country and was then island hopping and immunity shopping. When he couldn't find any, he returned to Sri Lanka. And that's where the US now has the best and maybe only opportunity to provide accountability to the victims of Sri Lankan atrocities. And no one else apparently can or has stepped up. Sri Lanka itself is still ruled by the Rajapaksa's party, and their allies have made no indication of launching a human rights investigation. Sri Lanka is not a party to the Rome Statute, so the ICC can't investigate. The United States may be the only venue that could take this on. And I've talked to a senior official at the State Department who recently confirmed that even though Rajapaksa gave up his US citizenship, he was a US citizen when he allegedly ordered those atrocities, and breaking substantive human rights laws would still leave him in US jurisdiction for those alleged crimes. And there's also another opportunity here, and that's to gather evidence and interview new witnesses that were too afraid to speak when the most powerful and famously vindictive family was in charge of that country. So the US has the jurisdiction, the substantive laws passed by Congress, and maybe the best and only opportunity to provide some justice to tens of thousands of grieving Sri Lankan families. One question I'd like to bring to this committee, this caucus, is specifically for the members here, would you support that investigation to happen? And I'd like to thank you for the time and opportunity to speak.
Thank you, and we'll get some response in terms of the question, and as we finish up with our witnesses. Next is J.S. Tsenium.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking the Caucus for Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka for inviting me to speak on this panel. It must be something of a record that a political leader was ousted for corruption and abuse of power through a popular outcry is back in the country he fled from, under the protection of the man who replaced him, while those who participated in mass uprising to overthrow him find themselves in jail. But the events in Sri Lanka in the past few months are a result of a popular uprising, which, while dislodging from power President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was unable to transform the fundamental structures of the state, which ensured that someone like Ranil Wickremesinghe replaced him to carry on pretty much in the same way as his predecessor. We have heard the word accountability repeated several times in the past few minutes. It could be said that because the Sri Lankan state's basic structures permit governments to be unaccountable, that it cannot be rid of leaders like Rajapaksa and Wickremesinghe, who can exploit the flaws in the system to practice authoritarian politics. Let me give you an example. People know that Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Chief of Defense Staff Shavindra Silva, who is, by the way, sanctioned from entering the United States, are accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during Sri Lanka's civil war against the Tamils. But few know that Rajapaksa and Silva were middle-level officers in the military when Sri Lanka was engulfed in the JVP internal armed conflict organized by Sinhala youth between 1987 and 1989. During this time, around 700 persons disappeared from the area under the control of Rajapaksa, where Silva served too. However, he nor the others were ever named in the Presidential Commission on Disappearances report published in 1995. Fast forward to 2009. Rajapaksa and Silva, atop the military chain of command, were able to perpetrate much greater devastation against the Tamils, for which they now stand accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Using the impunity from prosecution they enjoyed, both went on to commit bigger crimes. But this is not the end of this sorry saga. Following the civil war, Sri Lanka's political leaders refused to bring to trial alleged war criminals. One of those political leaders was Ranil Wickremesinghe, whose government from 2015 to 2019 refused to try before a hybrid tribunal proposed by the UN Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1, Rajapaksa, Silva, or any of the others. Not trying senior commanders of the military before a tribunal for war crimes was to pay dividends to Wickremesinghe 7 years later. After he became president in July 2022, Wickremesinghe used the same corrupt, abusive security sector to punish dissent against him. On July 25th, he ordered the police STF to clear Golface, the principal protest site, and arrest the protesters under emergency regulations. But worse, other dissidents are detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, or PTA, which basically makes the expression of dissent an act of terror. The act of repressing dissent is cheered on by Sri Lanka's elite on the pretext that stability is needed to secure a bailout from the IMF. The Wickremesinghe government is also suppressing the right to the freedom of worship of Hindu Tamils. On September 21st, at Kurundur Mele, the police arrested Tamils protesting a Buddhist shrine being illegally built by the Sinhala Buddhist nationalists in a place of traditional Hindu worship. Tamils protested because Buddhist monks and the military were not respecting a court order to temporarily prevent the building of the shrine. However, it was the protesters who were arrested, while the violators are free. So what is the path forward? While changing the structure of the ethnocratic Sri Lankan state is a long-term solution which only the Sri Lankan people can accomplish, the international community could help by urging Colombo to adopt measures that could go forward towards restoring the rule of law and human rights. And it is here that the international community has fallen short. Important international actors like the US could do much, but have not. Between 2015 and 2019, the US felt that it was easier to deal with a government that was ostensibly more open to Western powers and ideas like the Wickremesinghe government. This led to the US focusing on Colombo's supposed political stability and using it to cement military ties to combat China. For instance, the US funded freedom of expression projects. But the training of journalists supported by the US have not helped releasing the media from its Sinhala Buddhist bias, which regularly spits venom against Tamils, Muslims, and Christians. And close mill ties between the US and Sri Lanka have allowed impunity to fester. With Colombo seeking a bailout from the IMF and looking for financial support from the international community, the US and other countries should use their leverage to insist that conditions for financial assistance should secure security sector reforms such as demilitarization, while also abolishing obnoxious counterterrorism regulations like the PTA. Meanwhile, while it is commendable that Shavendra Silva has been publicly sanctioned by the US, there are other alleged war criminals like Defense Secretary Kamal Gunaratne who should be subjected to sanctions too. Between the years 2015 and 2019, the US, the UN, and much of the international community focused on the stability of the Sri Lanka government rather than supporting any type of effective accountability, whether for ongoing torture or for past mass atrocity. But such policies failed to achieve this much wanted stability. Neither did they support the people of Sri Lanka. Today, all Sri Lankans are much worse off than then, both from a human rights perspective as well as an economic perspective. Therefore, I urge policymakers in the US as well as the international community not to repeat the mistakes of shedding accountability for short-term gain. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Caleb, did we have another witness?
No, Congressman, these are all the witnesses. We only had 4.
All right.
Okay, and Laura is going to coordinate the question and answering.
All right.
She's doing it on chat while we are listening to our presenters as well as the listening audience. Go ahead, Laura.
All right, so our first question, by the way, I'm Laura Wilson. I'm Congressman Johnson's legislative director, so I'll be doing the Q&A session. Our first question is for Mr. Jafferji. In the chat box, it says, thanks for providing us with a review of the current status. You gave several recommendations for possible reform. However, you did not discuss security sector reform. Sri Lanka has one of the biggest militaries, which drains a lot of resources. Can you please comment?
Thank you for that question. Just to give you some context, our total expenditure from the government is close to 20% of GDP. Of the total expenditure, 40% is to interest, and 30% is for salaries and wages, and 10% for pensions. So if you look at functionally, the entire defense, security, outside interest costs is by far the largest, and it even dwarfs our expenditure on education and healthcare. So I have made a public comment previously that I have questioned that it's 13 years since the end of the civil conflict. Why does Sri Lanka have to continue to allocate so much of resources for a defense, security, police expenditure, and ask the question, who is the enemy? So there has to be some rationalization, and most of the expenditure is not for building defense capability by procuring armaments and advanced weapon systems, but a majority of it is for salaries. So the tri-forces basically have been estimated to be about 250,000 people, which comes to about 3% of the labor force, one of the highest ratios. And if you add the security, other quasi-security and the police all into it, you will get a figure close to 380,000 people. And I also commented that a country that has 22 million people, the number of people in the military dwarf even a country like the UK, which has 3 times our population, which is an international world power, but has a much smaller army than Sri Lanka has. So if I can finish by saying that the military is oversized to our needs.
Thank you. Our next question is for Mr. Jathindra. Could you discuss how the situation is currently in the North and East, and what and how politicians are reacting to the financial and political crisis?
Yeah, basically, you know, as I mentioned in my speech, Tamil politicians, they can shout something about it. Otherwise, they don't have ability to do response to the economic crisis, because, you know, the basic thing is we are powerless. So that's at least in the, if it is if there is a council is functioning, so we can, at least we can do something, but we don't have anything at the moment. So we can shout something about it. Otherwise, Tamil politicians cannot do much. But other thing is, the important thing is in about the diaspora. Now the one seat president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, is saying he's going to set up a diaspora office. He's set up a diaspora fund or something. But the problem is they still maintaining, they still banned many diaspora organizations and individuals. The interesting thing, they banned the Tamil, the transitional government of Tamil. The head of the TGD, Rudrakumaran, he is functioning in the United States. So the Sri Lankan government saying he's a terrorist, but my question is US promoting terrorism from United States? So the Sri Lankan government has no clear policy on diaspora. Other things. That's the main problem is the lack of ability to respond to the accountability issues in the last 12 years has proved clear. That's why I mentioned in my speech. So this is the situation in the North and East. We can shout something, but we can't do anything.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Ike. According to his reporting, it seems that the U.S. is ignoring human rights violators, especially Gotabaya Rajapaksa. What is the reason?
Like any problem, I think it's multi-factor. There are a number of reasons, of course. And looking at the legacy of human rights violators who have escaped accountability while on US soil, initially the problem was there were no laws. During the Nazi era, there was no law on the US books criminalizing the, enshrining our human rights values into substantive human rights law. In the 80s, that started to change, and there were laws written for war crimes, first genocide, war crimes, torture, female genital mutilation, and the recruitment of child soldiers. Of all of those laws that exist now, I think one of the problems is that they exist, but only one of them has ever been used, torture. The other ones have never led to nobody's ever been charged under those laws. And I think policymakers, maybe it's above my pay grade, but for lawmakers, there's seems to be some complaint from people who would like to use those laws that they're hard to use or written in challenging ways that have a very high burden. Another common constriction is that there isn't enough budget. These investigations are international. They involve being on the ground, gathering evidence, transcribing, having people who speak. So it's essentially investigating historical cold cases in a foreign language, and but there's all sorts of budgetary constrictions across government that have led to work not being completed. I think the number one reason, though, laws, budget are certainly part of it, is the political will to do it.
Okay, thank you. This next question is for any of our panelists. All options have been exhausted for accountability. What are the obstacles preventing the only possibility, namely ICC referral for Sri Lankan perpetrators?
I could take this one unless another panelist is ready to jump in. I think the simplest answer is that Sri Lanka did not sign the Rome Statute allowing the ICC to investigate. So there's no treaty that would allow the ICC to do the investigations or make the extradition requests.
And I guess we'll go to the next one. Can the Congress put specific financial sanctions on senior politicians through the Department of the Treasury, similar to those of Iranians or Russians? And if our panel doesn't know the answer, this is something that our office and Congressman Davis's can certainly look into. Okay, our next question is, no internal solution has been possible for the Tamil national question. as in many other successful cases of the universal right to self-determination by peoples of states via referenda, can the international community initiate such a universal right for the Tamils? Does anyone on our panel have want to take a stab at that one?
Laura, Dr. Sam Langovan raised his hand.
Okay. We don't have an answer to that one. Sam's hand is raised. Sam, please go ahead.
I sincerely thank Honorable Bill Johnson and Congressman Danny Davis and Laura and Caleb for arranging this. No matter who becomes the leader, it will be a Sinhala Buddhist. Is there any chance of any of this seeing a resolution? None of them are going to go against the majority Sinhala people because they will not be popular there. So do we realistically expect any resolution to any of this? Please explain to the congressman. The reality is, the majority view is that the country belongs to the Buddhists and the others are not welcome. Is that a fact? Will you explain, no matter who comes to the power, these things are not going to be resolved unless there is a punitive action taken internationally? Am I right or wrong?
Sam, is that question for me?
Yes.
You know, as a journalist, I can't color outside of the lines of my own reporting, but if I'm answering your question specifically trained on the issue of human rights and war crimes accountability, as far as I can tell, there is no motion in that direction from the current administration. There was a moment in time where the Rajapaksas were not in office, 2015 to 2019, and that interregnum period was a moment where the investigations into human rights violations were happening that did not come to fruition or lead to like meaningful change or accountability, but there was the beginning of something that then got terminated, and that work is left incomplete after Gotabaya was elected in 2019. So there was an opportunity. It seems like there isn't right now, and that's why I spoke about the possibility of the US courts acting in that role as the most viable option for accountability of atrocities in Sri Lanka.
Jatindra, I would like to hear your comment, please.
Regarding the India and the India continually.
Excuse me, I want Jatindra,
amendment.
please. Excuse me, I want to comment on my question if you don't mind.
Can you please?
No matter who comes to power, it's going to be a Sinhala Buddhist, and all these things are not going to be resolved by any of them because the majority will be against any resolution to these problems. Is that true or not?
Yes, that's true. Because but I can give a good example to you in what was happened during the Ranil Maitri government. The TNA believed that the government, the government was good governance, can able to bring a new constitution, but nothing done in the end. So this is a good example how the majority and Sinhalese, doesn't matter which party, the color of the party, and the name of the person. So this is the situation in the deep south. So any government, they would not respond to the accountability, particularly the war crimes and crimes against humanity. Any parties, any politician, they will never respond to this. This is the situation in Sri Lanka. And other questions regarding the India and why India continually insist the 13th Amendment. That is the declared policy stand of India. I think India will not change that policy stand because it is based on the Indo-Sri Lankan Accord. I don't think there's no any changes. Doesn't matter which party in office. That is the official stand of the foreign policy stand of the India. If the Tamil parties want to engage with India, they have to move based on the 13th Amendment. There's no any option. Otherwise, they have to go beyond the India. So they have to search friends who can able to overcome the Indian interest in Sri Lanka. That is the only option. Otherwise, India will not respond beyond the 13th Amendment. In the ongoing session, in the UNHRC session, also the Indian representative clearly stated that what is their stand on the Tamil issue, particularly the political solution for Tamil people. So I don't think they would change this policy stand.
Okay. And one last question for Murtaza Jafarji. What is the situation of Muslims today, and how are they reacting to the current crisis?
Thank you for that question. So what happened in Sri Lanka with the Muslim community is that under the name of religion, there was a terrible act committed during Easter 2019, where you had suicide bombers who went into 3 5-star hotels and 3 churches and blew themselves up. It has been found subsequently that it was nothing to do with connections with jihadists, but this was a local grown, may have been inspired by jihadists. And there may have been the hand of a deep state, that the deep state may have been aware of their activities, but they didn't stop them. So there's a lot of allegations that have been made by the cardinal that there was a hidden hand, but nothing has come to light officially. So after that event, the Muslims in Sri Lanka came under a lot of negative criticism and a lot of attack, basically, in terms of their establishments, physical harm, economic boycott, and all of us who had very little to do with these people did have some impact. But after this COVID crisis and the economic crisis, I think this has gone into the back burner. In fact, in a public commentary, I also warned that perhaps they will try to find scapegoats for this crisis, and that the Muslims who are a little bit more dominant economically because they're more traders and in business would be found fault with. But surprisingly, that didn't happen. So that was something welcome, and the anger actually got redirected to the politicians. And Sri Lanka's real problems are with very bad politicians of every type, basically. There is, I can't generalize and say that for everybody, but I would say a majority of the politicians should not be representatives of the people because they don't have the interests of the people at heart. They are self-interested. If I may spend a minute, because I've been listening to the conversation here, I'm a person living in Sri Lanka, and I believe that I'm a Sri Lankan first, and whatever my ethnicity or religion is a distant second. I believe the new generation have different feelings about each other. They are not haunted by the past. They do have issues with water under the bridge that their parents may have highlighted, that there has been various levels of discrimination. But the new generation is taking a very different viewpoint. And the Aragala movement, which was like a protest movement that kind of unseated Gotabaya Rajapaksa, they have very clearly come and said that our priorities are not ethnic differences, but it's about sound policies and good governance. So for a person like myself living in Sri Lanka, I'm actually optimistic that it is a great opportunity for somebody to come across and mold a common Sri Lankan identity. The problem is that our political leaders are all old people. They're all in their 70s and 80s. We need a whole new generation of younger leaders, which a political system doesn't necessarily allow to come up. And I'm hoping that at the next election, that some of these Aragala people who are fairly well educated, some of them even the American Ivy Leagues, do come into the political space and make lasting changes so that we as a people can live up to our true potential.
Great, thank you. That was a great comment to end on. I'll turn it back over to Congressman Davis, but thank you all to our panelists for joining us and for our audience. So Congressman Davis, did you have any closing remarks?
Well, yes, I do. And, you know, as I've listened to the questions as well as the presentations, one question mark in my mind is, given that our witnesses are basically journalists and probably have the closest relationship to the feeling of the general population, who would respond in terms of what is the general feeling of the population? I mean, I've been taught that, you know, if there are certain levels of acceptance, and that the larger the number and part of the resistance, that helps to move things a bit. And so how much general resistance would any of you suggest there is feeling as well as action in terms of the general population?
So maybe, Congressman, I can have a go first because I live in Sri Lanka. As I commented earlier, that most of the people are struggling to survive on a day-to-day basis. That you have an elite class who is fairly wealthy and they're okay, but a majority of the people don't have the same income levels. There is a significant, so top 20% account for 51% of national income, and the bottom 20%, bottom 20% account for something like 4%, 4.6% of national income. So although we are one country, the crisis is impacting people very, very differently, basically. So I would say that the people in the bottom part of society basically are struggling to make ends meet. And they are the people who are impacted with food shortages, and there's especially a protein deficiency. So because the price of chicken and fish have gone up 300%, eggs, etc. So they don't have time basically to worry about other ethnic issues, etc., because they are trying to survive. And as you know, there was this disastrous policy of not using chemical fertilizer. So the crop yields on most crops came down 30%, and farmer income got impacted, and food production got impacted, and we have had to import. Of course, your American government has given us aid, something like 60 million, 40 million to buy fertilizer and 20 million to buy food. So I would say that most of the people, because of the economic crisis, we are continuing to have fuel shortages, we are continuing to have electricity power cuts. They are struggling to make a go of their day-to-day lives, then worry about other issues that have plagued our society for a very long time. When things improve, perhaps their priorities may change.
If I might comment, you see, on the one hand, there are levels of economic income and stuff like that, which does impact on how people respond to a crisis, as is ongoing right now in Sri Lanka. But also, I think there are other issues which I try to highlight, which is basically the structural issue. You see, basically, Sri Lanka is an ethnocratic state, which is one of the reasons why even when this so-called Aragalaya or this people's struggle went on, as Mr. Jadindra said a few moments ago, the Tamils were not particularly interested in participating. Why was that? The reason was that they felt that the Sinhalese were not interested in helping them when they were facing the onslaught of the Sri Lankan military, which was basically a Sinhala military. So even at the best times of the so-called struggle against economic crisis, there wasn't a huge support from the Tamils in the north and east. That is one set of issues. The second set of issues is the repression that has come about after Ranil Wickremesinghe became president. So even this huge bunch of people who were protesting, who went to the point of physically walking into the presidential secretary, a punitive response from the state. They are scared because they are subject to the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the emergency regulations, and so on and so forth. Some of these guys, as I said, for an act of dissent, are being targeted as terrorists. So at that point, even if people are interested in pushing out Rajapaksa or Ranil Wickremesinghe, who are just leaders, but who even want to change the system, are scared to do that because the repressive apparatus of the state is seeing to it that they keep quiet and that they are punished for merely expressing their opinion about the state, about politics, and about how reforms should happen. Thanks.
And well, thank you both. And let me just in terms of responding to how much support there might be for the investigation of some of the events and activities. Representative Johnson and I will get together and have our discussion and come up with a position relative to the extent to which we will be supportive of efforts along those lines, and perhaps even come up with a written request or position relative to it. So we will convene ourselves and have a conversation about that. In the meantime, let me thank all of us for participating. I think, I end by saying that sometimes it's darkest just before dawn. And sometimes when, situations look dismal, continuation of effort ultimately generates relief and movement. And so we take that position and we close with that position, and we'll have some further activity as soon as we can arrange it and put it together. And thank you all. And that concludes today's event. Thank you very much.